chapter 5. In all of the previous chapters, we've been working with a phonological awareness base. We've been playing around with sound. We have been manipulating different individual phonemes. We've been listening to syllables. We've been taking those positions of those phonemes and where they occur into words, and we have been attaching the English code to them using the rules and constraints and positions that we find through tradition and through logical sequencing of where those sounds occur. Well, now we're going to take the next layer deep. We're going to dive into morphology. So going from our step of letters and group of letters attached to the sound, now we're going to put in that layer of meaning, which helps us to bridge the gap between our encoding and decoding into our vocabulary and our language comprehension side of Scarborough's rope. We'll see how that connects here in a little bit. So our chapter goals for this chapter are to explain why this is important to do that. Is this just an older student skill, or does this actually occur in the younger grades? Are there things within kindergarten and first grade that will help build a foundation for later on with these second and third graders and fourth grade students? The answer, of course, is yes, and we're going to look at the importance of that in this studying of morphology for reading, spelling, and vocabulary. We're also going to categorize our morphemes into their different features, knowing when to use them and when to not use them. These are important details, so when we're teaching our students to pay attention to these morphemes, they know what to do with them and they know how to encode them. We're going to look at some differences between some suffixes and why that matters. So we're going to actually start diving into a little bit of our vocabulary and some of our semantics. And we're going to look at ways that we can explicitly teach this morphology so students get it and it kind of embeds itself into our phonics / vocabulary instruction. All right, let's dive into it. The very first thing that we need to know is, what is morphology? Well, I'm going to look at the word parts in morphology and use that to help define this. So the first thing you're going to see is morph. Now, morph means to form or change into. So ology, of course, is the study of things. Therefore, morphology, by definition, is the study of how words are formed or changed in English, just like this little caterpillar. He is morphing into something new but related to what he was before. So morphology is the study of that. Now, there's a couple things to be careful of with morphology, and we want to make sure that we avoid using the idea of a word part exclusively to morphology. If we're not accurate in our language, it's going to confuse the students because syllables are also word parts, but there's a difference between a word part syllable and a word part morpheme, okay? Now, a morpheme, of course, is a unit of meaning that we move things around and put them together to make new words or to form new words. And it contributes to the meaning of the word. So a morpheme is a meaningful part that adds to the definition. A syllable is just going to be a piece of the word. It doesn't necessarily contribute to the overall definition or meaning of the word. But we might use a syllable to break a word into pieces, so it can be a word part, but it does not carry the meaning or the definition that a morpheme does. So a good definition for a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning that forms a new word. Here's some examples. Let's take SUB, okay? SUB can be a morpheme in something like the word submarine. That one consists of SUB containing its own addition to the meaning. It means below. And then marine also carrying its own individual definition or meaning, When we combine them together, we form a new word that's influenced by these two parts. Submarine, below water, that as part of a new word. Also substandard. Sub, again, means below. It's a prefix. Standard, of course, has its own meaning, such as this is the level of expertise or level expectation that you expect someone to be at. And when I put them together, this is below the expectation you expect someone to be at, is how we could define that by combining both of those word parts. So therefore, sub is a morpheme, a unit of meaning. Standard is a morpheme, that it's a unit of meaning. But let's look at subtle. Subtle. SUB doesn't have anything to stand on its own here in its contribution to the definition or the meaning of the word. The word subtle means it's ever so slightly as difficult to detect, and SUB doesn't contribute to that by itself. Neither does TLE. If I took TLE by itself, it has no meaning on its own. This morpheme must be together in order to have this definition. So this is an example of sub is a syllable, subtle, there's two syllables there, but it doesn't have a meaning by itself. It must be with the other syllable in order to have a definition. So sub in this circumstance is not a morpheme. So again, teaching kids that it's a small unit of meaning, it's going to contribute to the new form or the new definition. It is possible to have a syllable that's just a word part that doesn't have its own meaning. Now, this sometimes can also occur when you have word parts that sound similar or look similar. For example, let's take a look at joy and joined. If I said joy and joined, you hear joy in both of those words, but they are not related. Join is not the same definition as JOI. ED is a morpheme, but it has nothing to do with this other word. So these, of course, are not related morphemes, okay? Now, when I look at the next one, doubt and dubious. Doubt and dubious share the same base. Therefore, they are related. Excuse me. So those two can be considered related morphemes. Now, another funny one. A lot of kids sometimes think that these are related. The ham in hamburger has nothing to do with just ham. So even though HAM is a word part that they share, they are not morphemes that are related to each other at all. Okay? Okay, so let's play around with this idea of morphemes a little bit more. If it's tricky to find a morpheme or to find out how many morphemes you might have in a word, remember that a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. If you look at a word part and you ask yourself, does it have a definition or does it contribute to the meaning of the word, then it's a pretty good indication you have a morpheme. If it does not have a meaning or does not contribute to the definition of the word, then it's probably not a morpheme. Let's practice a little bit. Let's take the word forests. Do you see any word parts here? Hopefully you see two, forest and S. Forest has its own meaning and S contributes to that. S means more than one. So this word as a morpheme has two morphemes in it. Sorry, as a word has two morphemes in it. There is more than one group of trees. Forest is a group of trees. S means there are more than one. Let's try another one. Backpacker. How many units of meaning do you see in this word? Did you see three? Back has its own meaning, pack and ER. A back is something we all have. A pack is something we carry, and you can carry a pack on your back. So a backpack, therefore, is a pack we carry on our back. And ER is a suffix that means someone who carries a pack on their back. So all three of these units contribute to this new word, backpacker. Let's try another one. How about believed? Did you see two? Yep, ED means it happened in the past, and believe is something that you think is true. So this is something that you believed in the past, contributes to that new form or that new definition. What about mugged? Did you see two? Even though we have an extra letter here, that is fine. That deals with what we talked about in chapter 4 with making sure that things are accounted for sounds and spelling. But we have two units of meaning, mug and ED. What about mistletoe? It sounds a little bit like a compound word in backpack, but in backpack, those two units contributed to this pack you wore on your back. Is this a toe you shoot from a missile? Or a missile you shoot from your toe? No, it isn't. That makes no sense. Therefore, those two words or two parts don't contribute to the overall meaning of this beautiful flower that you kiss under at Christmas time. So mistletoe is its own morpheme. Both of those word parts have to be together in order to make the definition of mistletoe. There are two syllables, there are actually three, mistletoe. There are three there. So MIS is not its own unit, TLE is not its own unit, and toe could be, but it's not in this circumstance because it does not contribute to the overall meaning of this mistletoe. So just be careful of that. You'll see things like that happen all the time. Is somebody like, well, toe has its own definition. Yes, and so does missile, but they do not combine for the definition of mistletoe. Therefore, there is only one morpheme here. Remember, they must contribute to the overall definition of this new word we're making. Okay? Now, somebody's probably asking themselves at this point, why? Why do we care? This seems like a 3rd grade thing or 4th grade thing. Well, that's a very good question. So to answer this question, we are going to go ahead and ask the experts. Let's see what Ken Appel from the University of Columbia, South Carolina has to say.
So why do we talk about this? Because our written language, English written language, is a phonomorpho language in writing, okay? So yes, you think about sounds, but you must also think about morphemes. And if we didn't have this morphological component to our words, written words, it would really mess us up. So example there, if I spelled Canada just the way it sounds, it would be spelled that way, and Canadian would be spelled a totally different way. But Canada and Canadian are related, so we use that base word to help us spell the derived word. The same thing for sign and signature. A lot of people will say, who put the G in sign? That's ridiculous. It's there for the related word signature. Okay? So a lot of our words are spelled the way they are because of the morphology part, less than the phonology part.
So remember when we talked about the word origin helps us to know spelling patterns and helps us to know what spelling instances to use in chapter 4? This is a good example of that. Morphology helps us to do that. Well, someone might still be asking, well, that's great when you're talking about sign and signature or when you're talking about doubt and dubious. What about our kindergarten learners? They're not going to be spelling that kind of garbage. Well, let's take a look at Sue Scapetta from the International Dyslexia Association, and she's going to address that learning morphology from the beginning and why it's important. Oops. Let me see if I can get her started. There we go.
Morphology, but we're in particular going to focus on the idea that this is important from the very beginning of instruction. So we've known for a long time, IDA has known that morphology is important as a component of structured literacy forever. And it's always been recognized that this is an important topic as students become more advanced in their reading and spelling skills. So we've seen this as something that's important from third grade on or after kids have kind of developed the foundational skills they need for reading. But what's happening now is we're realizing that morphology is actually much more integral to the whole reading and writing process and needs to be integrated into everything we do from the very beginning. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. This is from Marcia Henry, who wrote in IDA's Perspectives on Language and Literacy back in the spring of 2019. She said that in the past 35 years, especially in the current decade, research in the area of morphology has continued to evolve. And she talks a little bit about how that research has evolved. And you might want to go take a look at that and see what she has to reference there about research. But her conclusion was the work of many researchers and educators illustrates the need to introduce morphology, which was once thought to be useful only in the upper elementary and secondary grades, in the early grades. So she's talking about this idea of what research is now showing us that this needs to be part of instruction from very early on. Louisa Most, in her most recent edition of Speech to Print, wrote, recent research indicates that morphological awareness is associated with reading and spelling growth from first grade onward, in parallel with phoneme awareness and general print knowledge. So these experts on reading are reiterating what we're learning from research, which is that we want to begin to integrate morphology in our work from the very beginning. So morphology is very important, and it's needed earlier than we may realize because it frames the entire spelling system. It allows us to understand what's going on with the spelling of words, which then unlocks all aspects really of reading and comprehension. It also frames the work that we do with phoneme grapheme relationships. We know that it is critical to explicitly teach kids how to analyze the phonemes, the segments of pronunciation that are meaningful in spoken words, and connect that to the graphemes, the letters and the combinations of letters that spell those phonemes in written words. We know that we have to teach this. Morphology is what allows us to make sense of it, to have kids understand why one particular grapheme is in a word and not another, along with etymology. The influences of etymology are also very important, but morphology is just hugely important even on its own. And one of the points about this is it has to really be integrated into what we're doing. We don't want to have a session where we're talking to kids about phoneme grapheme relationships and then do something separate on morphology. The goal is to bring it all together so that we see how all of these things work together to help us understand how spelling works. And one of the things about this is that this is especially powerful for dyslexic students. We want to provide really clean, clear instruction for dyslexic kids, systematic, explicit, so that they can really master these things and understand what's going on. And morphology, rather than being a complicating factor, is actually something that makes that clearer and easier. So we're going to
go ahead and stop there with her. I want to make sure to emphasize that this is part of our phonics instruction, and it feels even more part of it in those younger grades as just part of the explanation of the why we're using certain letters. It does separate itself just a little bit when you get older because you're dealing with some more complicated word parts, okay? We'll talk about that and what that looks in kindergarten and what that looks older grades, but remember there's a big difference between cat and cot, and there's only a one letter sound difference in there. That definition changes. A little preview is in the younger grades, you're going to see things like adding S to the end of the word, and that's where you're going to see early on indications of pure morpheme instruction, as well as the letter sound connection piece. Okay, so let's move on and let's get into morphemes a little bit deeper. If we have a good understanding of the morphemes, what they are, how they work together, what they do, it's going to make it easier for us to explain things to students and understand why they come into play for certain words and not other words. So, definitions. We know what morphology is. We know that morphological awareness then, is the awareness of that study between morphology. We know that a morpheme is the smallest piece of that meaning. There can be multiple morphemes in a word, or a word can be a single morpheme. We also know that affixes are word parts we add either to the end or to the beginning. You often hear those as prefixes or suffixes. Those grouped together are called affixes. So just keeping that affix as an umbrella term, these are individual word parts at the beginning and the end. They're all morphemes. Now, etymology comes into play because etymology is where the word comes from, its origin, and how it developed over time. And so sometimes when we look at these word parts, we're like, why did this happen? Why is this changed to there? And that's because of where the word has come from. Now, the next couple I want to have a little bit of disclaimer on: base, free bases, and bound bases, because we have something called root words as well. There is a little bit of debate between linguists that you have a base is Anglo-Saxon origin and a root is a Latin origin. They function slightly differently. A base is the core of the word. In an Anglo-Saxon word, the base is going to hold the main chunk of meaning. It can stand alone, but if it's bound, it's a root. So there's a little bit of difference there. A bound base is a base that cannot function by itself. A free base is a word that can, and most of those are Anglo-Saxon. And so to avoid confusion with students, I like to refer to Anglo-Saxon base words that stand alone and Latin roots that never stand alone. Latin roots can never be by themselves. They must have an affix with them, okay? But they do both carry the core base definition of the word. A good example would be a base, happy, and then adding on a suffix, N-E-S-S, ness, can create a new word, happiness, but happy can be by itself. A bound base or a root, like I like to call them a root would be a struct, S-T-R-U-C-T, U-C-T, S-T-R-U-C-T. Oh, I'm having a hard time spelling today. Struct is a Latin root that means something, but it cannot mean something by itself. Struct is to build. It must have either a prefix or a suffix to complete the word, okay? So we have free bases or bases and root words or bound bases. They're kind of used interchangeably. You're going to hear me refer to the bound ones, the ones that must require a partner, as a root, and the ones that don't require a partner, you're going to hear me refer to them as a base, okay? Now, I know a lot of you guys are familiar with a prefix. That is a word part that we add to the beginning. You also have a suffix, which is a word part we add to the end. Now, when we are adding things to the beginning and the end, some strange things happen. We might have an assimilation occur. Assimilation, it looks like a chameleon because chameleons change. And when an assimilation happens, something might change in the prefix or some letters might change in the suffix in order for them to fit to the root word easily. Maybe the letter will turn into a P, or we'll get rid of an I. Something changes in the prefix or the suffix so that it rolls off our tongue nicely. This happens in more complicated morphemes. You might have letters added on connection, actually is a really good one. C-O-N adds an extra N to connect the two word parts together. That's called a connective. So when we're talking about spelling, we want to make sure we point out, hey, this is a word that's going to assimilate, so a letter is going to change. Or hey, in this word, we're going to add a letter because it needs a connective for ease of pronunciation. Now, something else sometimes happens when we combine words together. You're going to have compounding. And compounding is exactly what it looks like. It looks like a compound word. We're going to have some word pieces that come together to form a new word that sometimes are individual morphemes combined to make a new one, and sometimes do not contribute individually to their whole. And we'll take a look at that. Compound words are really fun. Now, when this happens, we're going to talk a little bit later about derivation and inflection. I'm going to pause on those definitions for right now because they deal with suffixes predominantly. So we'll wait until we get to that section to talk about the difference between those two. Okay? All right. So let's go back to this idea of free versus bound. So remember, morpheme, a unit of meaning, right? Think of this as the center of the definition. A free center or a free base can stand alone as its own word. It needs nothing else to create its own meaning. We may add things to it to change or form a new version of the word, but it doesn't have to have it there in order to exist. So content words, these change often. We get new vocabulary words every day, and those are individual morphemes. If you ever read the book Frindle, they spent the whole book trying to create a new morpheme, a new word in its own right. They carry the bulk of the meaning for the whole word, and they evolve as our language evolves. So we get new words and new terms and phrases with every generation. Remember in chapter 4, we talked about what a batterfang was, and we looked at some of those passages from early English, and we're like, don't know exactly what it is. That's because those are all free morphemes, and they evolve as our language evolves. All of our nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are free morphemes. Now, something else that's interesting about our function words. Our function words are also free morphemes. They rarely change. They rarely have things added to them. They provide the structure for our sentences. And there are our pronouns, our articles, our conjunctions. Those are still counted as free morphemes. Even though they may not have such a straight across definition, they still contribute to the meaning of the sentence. They still hold a meaning all their own. For example, if I did was, or if I said the word the doesn't have such a beautiful, clear definition as rabbit does, but the does have a purpose. It does have a meaning. It distinguishes which item we are talking about. So it is important as a free morpheme in the sentence. Bound morphemes. So bound morphemes must have other morphemes with them to exist. They will not have a meaning by themselves. So you're looking at affixes, roots, prefixes and suffixes that we're going to add to different bases. We can also add these affixes to roots. These are predominantly Latin. They cannot stand alone. Again, this is one of the reasons why I take our Anglo-Saxon base words as bases, and these are roots because roots cannot be by themselves. Bases can. And then we have something called a combining form. These act a little bit like compound words. They can be in any order, but they are Greek-based and they cannot stand alone, but they can be in any order. Roots have to be in certain orders. You have to be the center of the word for a root. So looking at our affixes, we have derivational suffixes and prefixes. These will change the part of speech or how the word is used in a sentence. And inflectional just change a marker, whether the tense, the quantity, or we're comparing, but they don't change the function of the word in a sentence, okay? And those are predominantly suffixes. You might see a few prefixes, but not as often. Derivationals that change what the role of the word does in a sentence, those can be either or, okay? So let's take a little bit closer look. Our Anglo-Saxon words, remember these are related to our German language. They're base words, not roots, because base words can stand by themselves. You're going to find Anglo-Saxon compound words, suffixes, and prefixes. So compound words, 2 free morphemes. There's a lot of different types. You could have a noun and a noun together, an adjective and a noun together, an adjective and adjective, a noun and a verb and a verb. So it can be any of those type of words that you put together. And we usually stress the first syllable instead of the second one. And there really aren't a lot of spelling tricks and tips for those, but we kind of rely on the same thing we do with those is you can spell hot, you can spell dog, then put them together and you can spell hot dog. So a lot of times with these compound words, just break them up into their syllable chunks, spell each individual word, and put them together. Somebody asked me one time about hyphens, and when hyphens are used, that one's a little bit more tricky, and I don't have a straight up answer for that at this time, but I will. Okay. Usually the last word in a compound word will determine the type of speech it is, whether it's a noun or an adjective or a verb. And sometimes the two pieces contribute to the overall meaning, and sometimes they're unrelated, which is really kind of funny. And those are the funny compound words that we talk about later. They don't really contribute to the meaning, but you can also see sometimes where the idea came from, even though their straight up definition doesn't contribute to the overall meaning. Suffixes. So Anglo-Saxon suffixes that are inflectional are ed, s, es, er, est, and ing. These are some of the very earliest ones we learn. And their derivational might be hood, enly, ward, nest, less, most, and ish. These come a little bit later. So you can see why it's important to focus on some of these morphemes early, because just like we teach Anglo-Saxon words at the early grades as our most commonly used words, our most commonly used morphemes are also Anglo-Saxon based. So they kind of work together. Prefixes, and good. Latin are bound. They're built to bound a root. So remember, the root gets the stress of the word. They get the core definition. They're the major center of what the word means. And that will stay consistent no matter what prefix or suffix you put onto it. Okay? Now, prefixes generally show a sense of time, before, after, a sense of space, kind of here, there, up, down, reversing it, turning around, undoing it, or intensity. So that's one way you can help classify some of these prefixes, is that all of these different prefixes are going to show some kind of condition that deals with that. Often you will find assimilations in the prefixes for Latin word parts. For example, remember, assimilation means that you're going to alter so that matches or melds into the pronunciation and makes it easier to say. Well, suppose, S-U-P-P-O-S-E, is actually two word parts of sub, below, and pose, which is thinking about, so contemplating. And because our way we form our mouth, we don't want to say b and p right after each other. Sub, pose is not easy to roll off our tongue. We just assimilated that spelling into a second P to make it suppose and easier just to keep that sound over. So that's an example of assimilation. Okay. Now in your book, you will have a big list of different Latin morphemes, or Latin roots, and what they mean on page 139 and 140. She also gives later in the book a guide on which ones you should teach first, which ones are going to occur first, so you kind of have an order of introduction for those morphemes. Okay, let's look at another type of bound morpheme, the Greek combining forms. Now again, Latin roots must be the center, and then there's a definite prefix and definite suffixes. Greek combining forms aren't necessarily assigned those rules. They still have to be together, but you might have a word part that is a root in one word that all of a sudden now is a suffix in another word. So they get to be flopped around quite a bit, okay? Many Greeks words of combining forms have actually started to morph into being free morphemes just because of American slang, such as psych. Like, dude, you really psyched me out. They often are related to the original morpheme, but not a straight up definition across. A good example I can think of is graph. Graph is an original Greek combining form that would be something like autobiography or biography. And it meant writing at that point. And when you're using it as that Greek combining form, it means writing. But now we have in American English graph and graphing, which is still a written representation numerical data. And so therefore it's related to its origin, but it doesn't mean straight up writing as it does with a Greek combining form. That's a good example of taking a Greek combining form and creating a new morpheme from it. We gotta love American English. We just love taking words and making them their own thing. Again, on page 143 to 144, she gives you a whole list of Greek combining forms that you can have fun playing around with words with. And in that same list later on, she gives you an order of what's an appropriate order to teach some of those as you're teaching them individually or adding them to your phonics lesson. Okay, so again, we have this idea of syllables versus morphemes here. Let's see if we can distinguish between the two. How many syllables are in happiness and how many morphemes? So again, keep that in mind, individual units of meaning, okay? Okay, look at that one. Hopefully what you saw is oops, I guess I'm giving you all the answers. Hopefully you saw hap, ness is our syllables. Hap doesn't have its own individual meaning. In order to have its own individual meaning, you need to have happiness. So happy. So there are two morphemes, but there are three syllables. Slippers, there are two syllables, slippers, but there are two morphemes and they're different. Slipper is its own morpheme, S is its own morpheme. So take a look at that. Let me know if you have any questions about why those are split up the way they are for syllables and why they're split up for morphemes. Sometimes you have less morphemes than you do syllables. Sometimes you have less syllables than you do morphemes. But actually, let me rephrase that. I don't think you'll ever have less syllables. I think you'll be the same or more, because we may have a morpheme part that that means something but is multiple syllables into it. So I don't think you're ever going to have fewer syllables than morphemes. Okay. Now, I will share the slideshow with you so you can go back and listen to Louisa. She's going to talk, it's a little longer than I wanted to spend on this review, but she's going to talk about spelling by syllable and how that's different than learning to spell by morpheme. It's kind of an interesting approach, which you might use to help kids to spell. The only challenge I see with that is we don't often have our sounds matching the syllable breaks, because remember back in chapter 3 and chapter 4, we talked about that maximal output. I can't remember now. But it's where your sound doesn't necessarily translate with how we say it and where the syllable break is. So just be careful of that one. We're going to go ahead and skip that for now and let you watch it on your own. Okay, so we do have syllable types that matter, right? We've been talking about the difference of looking at syllables and not distinguishing those as morphemes. Well, we've got closed syllables. This is the most common type of syllable because we create our short vowels and they are followed by one or more consonants. We have open, so a long vowel sounds spelled with an open single letter, or you have a break right there. So there's not a consonant following after it. You get an open sound. You have a long vowel sound with the vowel consonant E. You have a vowel team. You have a vowel plus R. And then you have your consonant LE. And these are all going to be syllables. These are not morphemes, remember. These are just syllables. And they're all revolved around the vowel sound that you want. Now, we have that maximal onset rule, which means we need to make sure to pay attention to the division of syllables, because when we're teaching them to decode, we're going to have them look for those syllable pieces, and encoding not as much. That's why sometimes when I teach them how to encode with syllables, we talk just about showing them where the syllable is. But one of the things Louisa talks about that on her video that we skipped is how to do that without having to show them where the syllable is, but just kind of help them through the syllable parts. So in a compound word, you are going to divide between the two words. Football is foot and ball. That's where our syllable comes naturally. In a word where you have one consonant sitting between two vowels, you can either go before the consonant or after the consonant, depending on the desired vowel sound. So if you split it before the consonant, you now create an open syllable. Your vowel should be long. If you divide it after the consonant, you've created a closed syllable and your vowel will be short. And I always like to do this with the kids, is put the word up there and we just divide it both ways and say, do we want pilot or do we want pilot? And they have a lot of fun going, I want a pilot. You're right. Do I want a wagon or a wagon? They have way fun doing that one. Then we're going to look at the next rule is you're going to divide between two consonants. So you have a vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel. You're going to divide right between the two, and that creates a short vowel in the front, and it may or may not create a short vowel in the end. Depends on what comes after the vowel sound. Something to be careful of with that, though, is do not divide between digraphs. That is not the double consonant. So you're looking at double consonants that don't create a unique sound. So then you have consonant LE, which is a separate syllable. Consonant LE is always going to be separated from its syllable partner because it's its own unit. Like table, gentle, TLE, always separate that. Always separate prefixes and suffixes as their own syllables. And again, do not divide between digraphs. That's just two letters making a unique sound. So you have to think of a digraph as its unit. Think of a digraph as like a G. G says G. TH says th. You're not going to split a sound. It just doesn't work that way, even though they're letters. So let's practice that a little bit. Let's break up these words into their spoken form and then their written form. So remember, this written form is how they would be divided into the dictionary, and where those syllable breaks could matter. Now, again, using the spoken version of the syllable break can help with encoding, but the written version helps with decoding and knowing what the vowel sounds are going to say. So there's kind of a tool you could use either way for that. So once we've written out what the dictionary syllabication is, then we'll find out what the rule is to help with that. So let's start with the first one. If you say lemon, it's lemon, right? And so you usually have the lemon. Tricky part with that one is if you're asking the kids, say, well, we have le, you're talking about a short vowel, and they'll get confused if you're like, there's no closed syllable. You can encode it like this, but make sure to point out and bring out that we divide it after the M to make our short vowel. Or when you're decoding, you would be splitting it here after that short, after the M to create the short vowel. So this rule is that vowel, consonant, vowel, but you're going to split after the consonant to create that short vowel. I hope this is making sense. Again, encoding, you can do it this way, the spoken way. Decoding, you're going to want to help them to see that this rule applies, and that creates the vowel sound that you want so that they can figure out the correct way to read that word. So let's try the next one, okay? We have blackout. Now when we speak it, we say black out or blackout. I argue that I always say blackout. When Louisa taught us this, she had blah and then put the k over because of that maximal onset rule. Again, debate whether or not that's actually accurate. The whole point is the written is going to be your black out. That's where your rule comes in, which is your compound wording, okay? You'll see the same thing with headache. If we said it, headache, we're going to have that maximal onset rule occur again, headache. Written, of course, is your head and your ache, and you compound it. So compound word, that syllabication rule. I wouldn't stress on this too much if you were encoding it. I would just say black out and headache. I think that would be much easier for students to recognize that you have two words there that you're compounding it together. So let's just quickly check the other ones. You have bleeding, and of course your suffix is going to be your written form of that, or your syllabication of that. Clever, clever. Take a look. What do you guys think the written version would be? If you said that VC vowels, that vowel, consonant, vowel pattern, you are correct. Objective, what do you think that one would be? Objective. And then the written form would be prefixes and suffixes. Good. You have a prefix, a root, and a suffix. Okay, so some of you guys might be wondering, why do we care? Well, really, it's using the right tool to help students have easier access to the task at hand. If they're going to try to encode one of these words, you might be okay with doing it as the spoken syllabication to help them break up those syllables into parts. Again, with the headache and the blackout, it might just be easier to do the compounding the two words together. I personally have found that students find that easier. But when it comes to writing it, when it comes to decoding this word, you're going to want to pay attention to those syllabication rules because that helps determine the vowel sound. It's about utilizing the right tool at the right time. All right, so if we're going to orthographically map that, then what we're looking at is the same kind of a thing, right? The syllable mapping starts with breaking it up into syllables. You can help them to encode it, then teach the division rule and noting the differences between what we say and what we print, okay? So if our first word was rabbit, I probably would go rabbit and move the B over. As we're writing it down, say, okay, ra is R-A, and then bring out, boys and girls, we're actually going to put a B here because we need to make a short vowel, and then finish encoding it. It might be easier if I give you an example. Let me give you an example on the next one. So the next one was commitment. This one's easier because you have suffixes and roots in there. I would do commit, meant. We would encode com, and then mit, and then meant, and then put it together and read it. Rabbit's a little tricky. I probably would have done rabbit, put the RA, put the BIT, and then talked about why that B was there, just for encoding. Again, there could be some confusion, so choose which one your students understand easier. It gets a lot easier when you're dealing with suffixes and prefixes. All right, so moving on to morphemes. Some of the fun things with morphemes is to recognize that they are part of a prefix, a Latin root, or a Greek combining form or suffixes. So this exercise lets you have a chance to decide and separate, well, what are they? And this is just practice for you to decide, can I identify the morpheme structure? So take a few minutes, pause, and go ahead and split those up. Which one of these are prefixes? Which ones are Latin roots? Which ones are Greek combining forms? And which ones are suffixes? So you had a chance to pause, and now let's check, see how you did. I'm going to go ahead and just click through, check through your answers and see if there's any that are confusing or don't make sense. Please feel free to talk to me if you're looking through at them and saying, okay, yeah, that's a prefix, that's a suffix, that's a Latin root, or that's a Greek combining form. It really is getting familiar with what they do and how they work. And listing them like this is not the most efficient, to be honest. Same thing, here is a chance to look at Anglo-Saxon base words, Latin roots, and Greek combining forms. Go ahead and pause, divide them up, see how you did. And then again, it's really going to be about getting familiar with what are which. You can use some of those Greek language origin things that we talked about in chapter 4 to help you, if that works. So go and pause. All right, come back and take a look and see how you did. You might have to pause it too, just so you can adequately check. I am clicking through these pretty fast. One of the nice things is the Anglo-Saxon are easy because you're basically looking at whole free morphemes, and Latin roots I think are pretty easy just because you're looking for pieces that are not ever going to be separate. And Greek combining forms, you can start to see where we've stolen some from, like microscope, photograph. We've started stealing some and making them their own free morphemes. Like, nope, that's Greek. Okay, so moving on. This is one of my favorite activities because we talked about compound words. And compound words are usually a lot easier. We teach them first and work with them sooner in our educational prowess. And you have two independent morphemes, so two Anglo-Saxon bases that we put together, and they create a whole new word. The last word in the compound will identify the item. So it'll tell you if it's a noun or if it'll tell you if it's a verb. So it'll tell you the role of the word. But then sometimes it'll actually tell you what the item is, like identify an object. And then sometimes it doesn't relate to the other pieces. It's not the sum of its parts. What's fun is looking at some of these and realizing that, okay, I can see the thought process to how they got this word and why they put these pieces together, especially if you know where the word comes from. So if we look at bookshelf, we know that it is a shelf made for books. So therefore, that last word tells us what it is. It's a shelf. But if I look at crackpot and I think, well, it's not an actual pot that's cracked. It does not make the sum of its parts. The funny thing is think about in the history of the word, the last thing you wanted, the thing that could totally ruin your day, is to get a crack in your pot. And it was just crazy. It was just not fun to deal with. So that word has evolved into, well, you're a crackpot. You're useless. You're not something I want to have happen. And so it's really kind of fun to joke around with the cleverness and the humor of our English language based off some of these compounds. So now you're going to take a minute, you're going to pause, you're going to ask yourself, okay, is the word telling you the last word tells you what the item is, or is this one of those compounds that's not a sum of its parts? Okay, so how did you do? We have catnap is a nap, bow-legged is a leg that is bowed, a cowlick, I skipped one. Clothespin is a pin used to hang up clothes. A cowlick is not a place where you licked by a cow, but it sure does look like it. A wine glass is a glass made for wine. Earshot is not getting shot in the ear, but it's something that you can hear within range. And so you start to see how they're very closely connected, but it's not a sum of its parts. Jawbone is actually jaw for your bone, or bone for your jaw. A playpen is a pen that you're playing in for a little kid. Mainstream is not the river in the middle, but you can see how that ideas go down the center of social thought and consciousness, which is the main part of that social stream or that social consciousness. And so it seems like it relates to the stream and the main part of the stream. So a lot of these that are not the sum of its parts definitely play around with where the word originated. Such like hobnob. They used to call knobs. The people used to go kiss up to people at bars and things and buy them drinks. So you can hobnob. Yep. So you can see where they're related, and that's the fun part of entomology and kind of playing around with, oh, okay. We can see where it came from, even though it doesn't quite make sense now. All right. So the last activity that we're going to take a look at is exercise 58. And this one is playing with the assimilated prefixes, right? Now, a root or a prefix root structure have a hard time with getting our sounds to come out right. So what they'll do is they will double consonants in that first and second morphemes to join them up so that we have an ease of pronunciation, right? There are a lot of prefixes that will slightly alternate their form so that they can match the root word a little bit better. And it then melds into the next word. Its a whole purpose is to help us say it easier because we tend to be lazy. Good example is AD. We're going to add another D for addition and address. You have accept. It's actually AD adcept, but we changed it to a C, so that ease of pronunciation. Affect, aggressive, and allow. They're all part of this AD to or toward morpheme, but we're going to just make that nice, easy transition. Again, this is helpful for older students, but not necessarily for younger. Their speech to print book is a great resource to help clarify some of that practice for you. And look up the etymology. If you're not sure as you go through your curriculum and you're looking at the morphology, look up the etymology online, and that's going to help you a ton. Okay? All right. Play around with some suffixes a little bit more in detail. Suffixes, of course, are added to the end of a word to adjust the meaning. You have first inflectional suffixes. These are the ones that are learned first, as early as kindergarten because they do not change the role of the word in the sentence. A noun will stay a noun, a verb will stay a verb. The difference is we're adding some clarification and altering the definition a little bit. For example, if you have a noun and you're going to add an apostrophe S, then you're showing possession. So now it's still a noun, but it's going to show ownership. You can show gender by adding AE, and you can show number by adding ES or S. Now with verbs, you can show tense by adding ED, ING, and you can show voice by adding EN. You can also show mood by adding EN as well. In adjectives, you can compare with EREST, and adding these to the suffix, again, doesn't change the role in the sentence. It adds some clarification to its definition or its meaning. They keep their order, their word order as well. So if I have I act in an odd manner, if as soon as I add a suffix to it, it stays in the same location. He acts, she acted. We're just adding a little bit more clarification to the meaning and helping the comprehension of the sentence, really, because the suffix is adding that meaning onto it. Now, children will generalize these inflection rules before they learn the exceptions. So you'll see kids who will say, I acted in an odd manner, or we goaded to the store, things like that, because they're like, oh, if I teach you that happened in the past, I'm always going to add AD, so they generalize that. We have to clarify and say, no, this is when we're going to do this and do that. And it comes in with encoding, and it is tapped into, again, in grammar. So when we talk about combining grammar into writing and combining grammar into phonics, grammar shouldn't be a separate piece all by itself. It needs to be embedded into our encoding and embedded into our writing portion of our day. So why is spelling the past and plural difficult? Well, because we have some weird things happening. You're going to have S and ES. You're going to have ED with past tense verbs. You're going to have ED saying D and ed and t. You're going to have TION and things like that. These kind of challenges with these suffixes require a developed morphological awareness. So we have to pay attention to these things and explain why we're adding this ending, what it does, and what it says. So hopefully what you're seeing is this idea of these suffixes, these ideas of these endings, and this is a combination of, again, your encoding, your decoding, and your grammar all mixed into the same area. Now, all of those irregularities that you get that come in through some of these past and plurals are legacies from the Middle English days. So anytime you have those irregular plurals or those irregular past tense, those are leftovers from Middle English, and we just have to teach those like heart words. There's really no rhyme or reason, because early Middle English and Old English, Anglo-Saxon is where we find most of our problems before they standardized it. Again, we probably could yell at Noah Webster and say, hey, how come you didn't standardize it? But that's a debate for another day. It's only been around for like 200 years, so we'll just have to work with it until maybe eventually it will. Maybe eventually our language will change and it will be a lot more phonetic and accepted that way. All right, so let's continue on with this idea of spelling, and that good readers and spellers will have large vocabulary so they can notice these familiar phonemes, and they'll get clues to what the word means, and they'll get clues to how the words are put together. So we're actually going to utilize that as a teacher to understand where our students are and where their development is. This is one of the most fun things that I love to do, is to analyze the spelling work of our students, analyzing the spelling tests, doing a spelling inventory, and being able to pick out exactly what stage of this development with phonological awareness, for orthographic mapping, for morphological steps, where along this whole development is the student. So some of the most common spelling errors that you're going to see is omission of morphemes. They're going to kick off morphemes. They're going to phonetically spell morphemes, or they're going to substitute inflectional suffixes. Now, that's when we're looking at the morphological errors. Earlier, we talked about looking out for phonological errors, and in Chapter 4, we talked a little bit about looking out for those letter-to-sound connection errors. So this is this third layer of having a morphological error, and they're mostly going to be around either keeping the morpheme out completely, phonetically spelling the morpheme instead of using the heart pattern for it, or substituting inflectional endings, as you're going to see a lot of that. If you see those errors, they do not have a strong morphological understanding of that part. So here I have a little sample of some student writing, and we can look at, my ideal house would be a regular house with regular stuff in it. And we can go through and pick out what's going wrong with those words and find out where their level is. So here's another example. If the word was classes and they spelt it like this, then you have a phonetic spelling in morphology. So the phonetically sounds there. It's a little bit of a grapheme error because the letter isn't correct, but not really, because ES is a morpheme piece. So this is a morphological error. We need to go back and reteach this ES and the concept of when to use ES for our plural. Looking at this one, you have joys. Right here, they wrote Joyce. This is an inflectional ending, a morphological error with knowing that joys. They have a slight phonological issue here as well because they're failing to recognize this is not a soft C, it's a Z sound where you have that plural making the Z after the Y sound. Take a look at mixed. What happened here? If you notice that they had a phonological misspelling of the ED, you are correct. That's because the X has a voice off, and so the sound that you're going to make for ED is the voice off sound, which is that T. How about games? So we have games. They recognize that they have a plural, but they hear the Z, so they're adding that Z on there. Yeah, that's again teaching them that the Z is going to be made with the way that the word is, with the long vowel sound. Okay, how about started? Again, a morphological issue with the ED and the ID. This, of course, says ed, started, and phonetically they hear the sound, but because the T is a T and it's one of the sounds that ED can make, we don't say start to or started. We have to add the vowel ed on there to make it flow off our mouth. So anytime a word ends in a D or a T, you're going to use the ed pronunciation for ED. Same thing when you look at this next one as a spelling error for ED. If you notice, ED is a big one. It has a lot of times you're going to have problems with that word just because it is. Now this one on noticed, they have an orthographic error with the I and the soft C. So you have not only the ED problem that we were talking about before, but you also have a sound spelling connection problem there. So knowing that lets you know, okay, here I'm going to start working on reestablishing that connection and continue just to clarify what the spelling problem was. So in this group, we're going to look at what is the common error. So I have every, uncle, and disgrace. If I'm looking at every, I notice the F instead of the V. Uncle is a G instead of a C. And disgrace has a grace instead of a grace. And what I know about V and F is this is unvoiced and voiced. This is an voiced C. That's a voiced G. So it looks like we're having confusion with the voiced and unvoiced sounds at those parts of the word. Let's try the next one. Transit, furnish, clench. Looking carefully at it, I see that we're missing an N in each one of these. So there's an omission of a nasal in the medial position. So that would be a phonological issue. They're not hearing that N, and so we need to break that up a little bit and help them to clarify and hear that transition from that A to N, to N, and help them to identify that and put that into the word. Look at the next one. We have blind, fight, doctor, and looks like we're missing blind, missing the D, missing the fight, and missing the doctor. So it looks like we're having a final consonant, a final stop consonant omission, and a little bit of a morpheme error here with the ER. Okay? Support, impeach, accept. What do you notice? If you noticed an and an M and an GX to thing, you're looking at something with sound, right? You've got this one here is an orthographic with being our schwa misrepresentation. Impeach is IN, IM morphological. And phonological has that voice on, voice off issue going with accept. How about the next one? Serpent, awareness, independence. Which one is what? What's the error? This one's kind of mean because this one is all schwa. It's all Latin-based schwa problems. And so that was a little higher independent one, or higher level to help the back. So as a teacher, you'd look through these and say, okay, so they're getting rid of this. I'm going to do this, or I'm going to spend time on this section again. I'm going to walk them through it. And it's not like you have to find a whole new program or a whole new wheel to invent, but you're going to spend time in that. Say, let's take these words and let's decide why they do this, why these sounds are there, why you're making this mistake. So you're just going to walk them through it again. Okay? So a little bit more practice with some spelling errors. If you're looking for a phonological error, you're looking for a sound that is not being represented or not heard. So fit, fet, this is a different sound. This is an eh, that's an eh. Orthographical errors are where you have the sound represented, but it's not represented with the right letter. So pick, p-ick, has all those sounds, p-ick, but CK is not being utilized. And then morphological, focus in on the suffixes and prefixes. That's how you're going to find the errors most often there. Okay, so we mentioned a little bit about this TD, ED thing. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that to talk about why there's so many problems with the suffix ED. Okay, well, it's because ED can be pronounced in 3 different ways. Id or ed, t, and d. If you noticed, a voiced sound will always have a d with it because your voiced is already on. So ED will make d when the last sound in the word is a voiced sound. If the last sound in the word is an unvoiced sound, then ED will say t. Okay? Now when you're encoding, you're going to want to help kids find the base word and help them build that first and then ask what the sound was. And it's actually kind of easier at that point. For example, if I was doing the word sniffed, and I say the word is sniffed, boys and girls. What's the word? Sniffed. I like to watch my dog as he sniffed all of the roses. Sniffed. So then we're going to break it up. S-n-i-f-t. Boys and girls, I'm going to encode a base word I heard. I heard sniff. So let's encode that one. Sniff. We just did sniff. You can do all the letters like normal. I say, boys and girls, since my base word was sniff and sniffed happened in the past, I had that t sound. How do I want to represent t in the past morpheme or the past ending, this past suffix? And you can bring up again that it's ed. Now, when the suffix ed says id is literally only when the word ends in a t and the word ends in a d. Since those are the 2 sounds we can use, we don't want to have that double sound, and so we actually add that slight schwa in there. Okay? Now, we do have a couple of exceptions because English we always do. If you end in a vowel sound, you're going to use that d pronunciation for ed. Followed, enjoyed, played. So voiced and vowels, which I never really worry about that because vowel sounds are always voiced anyway. So I always kind of just run with it's a voiced, so put the d sound on there. Okay. So let's take now a pause from that inflectional, some of that spelling error looking at, and let's take a look at derivational suffixes. Derivational suffixes are going to change the word into a different function. So all of these that are dropping down right now are endings that you add to words that make them nouns. In the next column, these are all the pieces of the end suffixes that you're going to add to make them a verb. Here are some suffixes to add that make it an adverb, and some suffixes that make them adjectives. So I can take a word and I can say commit, right? Commit is an action. I will commit to doing something, but then it turns into a noun when I add ment to it. commit, meant. It now has a different role in a sentence. Magic magic is a thing. I can perform magic. So I guess that one kind of says like magician changes into a person now. But I think it's still a noun. That wasn't a very good example. You have, it's hard to think of them off the top of my head. Category is another one. Category is a noun, but if I do categorize, adding IZE, that's now turning it into a verb. So that's what derivational suffixes do. They will be added to a word and they change the role in the sentence. Now, this is definitely more common in expository text. You don't necessarily see a lot of it in narrative. But you can have some funny things happen with schwa, that schwa will show up or you'll end up with a schwa added. So this is usually in longer suffixed words. So if I have able and ly, there's not going to be a change to the base word. We call those neutral. If you have ite, you're going to have a shift in pronunciation, which then of course make them non-neutral. So severe will turn into severity when we add ity. You have a shift in pronunciation. This is important to help kids see when they're working with these older words or these older student words that you're going to have a shift in pronunciation when you add certain suffixes on it, because again, your schwa gets moved around to where you accent it a little different. Some interesting things that happen as we're looking at these suffixes is that you will always have the derivational suffixes come first. You have that change in the base word pronunciation. You might even have some of the letters dropping, or you might have doubling some of those for the derivational complexity. And you're going to have some of this TICISI sh sound happening for like Martian or efficiency. So you have a little bit of sound variation coming in. Something I did think was awfully interesting is we do have a few throwbacks from the Middle Ages because when they standardized, they didn't standardize everything. Where you have like keep it is how they used to pronounce it, but then it has become kept, which has the ed spelling that we talked about, but they removed one of the vowels to keep that short vowel sound. Just kind of an interesting thing that happens. Now, what does that mean for instruction? Well, first of all, it just means be aware. As the teacher, the more you know, the more you're going to help them to be able to grow. So be aware of these things so as they come up, you'll be able to explain them, you'll talk about them. This is why it's important to preview some of your work, your lists, and your encoding pieces beforehand. Check out the etymology, get familiar with how the structure is, so that way you can answer some of these concerns as you're working. A little bit more preparation on our part as an educator, but it's going to pay its weight in benefits at the end. So we need to be able to identify a morpheme in an own word. We need to look at how our explicit instruction would be different for older kids as well as younger kids. We need to take a look at how that affects the orthographic mapping of the word, how those morphemes are connected to the form and the meaning, and then what is the way that I'm going to assess or double check to see if they understand what we're doing. This isn't something that we're going to do in addition to our phonics. It's going to be part of our normal phonics encoding piece. I know we've talked about different rotation schedules, and when you're working with certain letter patterns, this is an opportunity for us to talk about how do we build in these morphological pieces, these suffixes, into that week and not making them separate, just make them part of the work that we do. And that will be the sequencing that we'll look at. So a couple of ideas for assessing. You can do things like closed tasks. You can do word pairs, analogies to help you understand or help to gauge whether or not they understand the meaning of the word. Some of the encoding natural things that will happen with our spelling test is another way that you can assess how they're gaining their morphemes or gaining their understanding of how those work together. And just be aware of some of these unknowns. We've talked about some of these limitations. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I'd like you to go ahead and pause and look it over so you can take a chance to say, okay, these are things I need to keep in mind as I'm going through. Now to the actual planning of a morphological word study. These are just some activities that you can use inside of your word study to help practice some of these morphemes and some of this morphological word analysis. It's going to be a much better idea for us to take a look at your individual classroom level, and it's going to fit within your phonics section of your day. So this isn't an extra day or an extra set of time. So we're going to look at explicit instruction in word parts. We're going to connect it to intentional vocabulary. We're going to look at a study of how the word is formed with the pronunciation if it applies. Okay? And we're going to teach it in stable morphemes first. We're going to use the morphemes that are used more often, or start with those. And then don't worry about the ones that change pronunciation until much, much later. And I will have some of these links clicked onto you where you can have some examples of a scope and sequence. You can find some of those guides to help you build a scope and sequence where the orthographics come in. But again, those are just recommendations in a general form. It would be much better to talk individually about how that would work within your scope and sequence for your curriculum and how that works within the day and the week. Okay? So a couple of supports you could have is something called a morphology wall. This is different than a sound wall. It's just a way to help when you're working with prefixes and roots, bases, and suffixes, that you can have a reference sheet for students to pull word parts from and build words from. If you're interested, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in our sessions. You can also work with a word matrix. I kind of like word matrices a lot because you have your root base, you have your prefixes in yellow, and you have your suffixes in red. And the student then goes across to build words. They can skip some of these doubled up yellows on the side. They just can't go down and then across. So if I have instructive, then I've just formed a word. Or indestructive, and I can go across and form all these different words, and they're going to use some of these little definitions, and they're going to build the definition onto that to find out what the whole word means. So for example, I took re from this box, I took con from the one across from it, then I took the base word, struct, and then I took shun from right across there. I can go diagonal this way, that's okay, into the red. I just can't go down. So if I take those pieces, then I have re means again, con means to do together, struct is to build, and ion is the act of doing so. So I've just built the word reconstruction, and if I take my pieces over, then I think, okay, this is the act of building something together or putting something together again. We do have to talk about it a little bit to put it into a more kid-friendly term, but from that you can glean that, oh, reconstruction is to build it again or put it together again. So word matrices are fun to do that with because they can just take the pieces and then you put the pieces together. You can do it as simple as go with inflectional ending or more complicated with Latin bases and or Latin roots and prefixes and suffixes. So simple to more difficult. You also can have reference cards that tell you the prefix or suffix and tells you what the meaning is, gives you an example, and then it can tell you the frequency of occurrence. So like, oh, how often are we going to see this suffix or this prefix? Some students find that helpful as well. A couple other fun activities is you can have for inflectional suffixes, you can put the suffix on a little cube and then have a bunch of words, roll the dice, and then match them up. So you can have kit with an S becomes kits, dots with an S. You can do it with sticky notes of prefixes as well. You can also have cut in word parts and just start building word parts together in chains. Those are kind of fun. Just having kids build that way. Sticky notes make it great to be able to move things around so the visual learner can manipulate those suffixes and prefixes around to different places. You're going to want to look at, as they're doing this, what are they doing phonetically? So you can catch any of those word parts. If they're doing things phonetically, then you're not seeing the ability to look at the words as meaningful parts. So just keep an eye on that as you're looking at activities. Let's see. Skipping a couple of those. You can take a look at those ones. Break the longer words into familiar parts. Put them in circles. Put them in boxes is another way to look at that. Looking for patterns. taking words with the same morphological pieces, looking how they work together, having like commonalities. Some of the word family things come super handy. If you're dealing with students who are English language learners, teach the most common ones first. Pay attention to the spelling and the pronunciation. Look for any cognates that exist in Spanish. That is incredibly helpful for Spanish speakers, is because Spanish is a very one-to-one correspondence language, and it is very Latin based. So look for those connections, especially for English morphemes. This was an idea brought forward by one of the other coaches that I thought was kind of interesting, is if you were looking at a particular word, you can use this idea of possum to help provide ways to know or to word analyze, I guess word attack, because really what we're doing is building word attack skills. So you start with the phonology, you can look at the orthography, go into the syntax, then look at the semantics, understand if you've heard that word before, and then build into the morphology. And it's just a really good way to give them some word attack skills. Here's another one, some word analysis. You're going to take a look at the morphemes, talk about those pieces, talk about the syllable pieces, talk about the graphemes used, and then take a look at the phonemes. So we're just taking it apart and taking the pieces at a time. With the definition, you can add the semantics in there. What does it mean? It just helps them to really be critical and really be thinking about these words instead of just memorizing them or not caring about them later. This is the words in context. Like we were talking about, you can use it to analyze the assessment of their development. The close strategies really help with that a lot. You can have them do word sorts of saying, okay, I hear the t sound for the ed, I hear the d sound for the ed, or I hear the ed sound, just so they start filling out those patterns. And then taking a look at practicing why we're going to use certain plurals. It's just getting enough time to spend on these different rules and saying, okay, why do I use this? Why do I not use this? You also have a spin and say. You can do roll and reads. Those are great. Again, there's a lot of opportunities to have this built into your normal lesson, but it really should come down to individualizing what it looks like in your classroom, what your curriculum does. So, as much fun as that chapter was, we are all finished. So I hope that explained our morphology. Please reach out to me and talk to me about how those things might work in your classroom and where those might fit in.